and welcome back to Philosophy for the Lockdown and Beyond. The sun is shining and we're doing loads of Kant. What could be better? My name is Nausicaa. I'm a moral philosopher. I'm not a relativist and I'm not a consequentialist. If these kinds of terms don't make any sense to you, please stop here and go back and watch some of the other videos. Also, please don't watch this video unless you have watched the Deontology Part 1, because in Part 1 is where we started looking at Immanuel Kant's The Groundwork of the Metaphysics of Morals, and we looked at the first third of the book. So if you haven't really followed that bit, you won't be able to follow this bit, where we look at the second third of this book. I know, it's unbelievable, this tiny, tiny little book, and it's going to take us ages to go through it. To be fair, if you were to take an introductory course at university on Kant's moral theory, you'd be expected to spend at least 6 lectures and 6 corresponding seminars on this book alone. So we're really compressing things here. Okay, so last time we looked at the first third of the book. Take a second, pause the video and write down 3 things that you remember from the first video. I'll give you a sec to do that. Okay, it'd be great if amongst the things you remembered were these 3 things. Kant argues that the good will is good unconditionally, and it is the only thing that is good unconditionally. It is not dependent on anything else. Its goodness is not dependent on the consequences that the act brings about, and its goodness is not dependent on desires that might motivate the act. So only the good will, on its own, pure, shines like a jewel. We also talked a lot about acting out of duty as opposed to acting with duty. Acting out of duty is acting out of the pure motive of the moral law, because this is what you ought to do. Acting with duty is coincidental. It's the shopkeeper who gives the right change, therefore acts fairly, but only because there's a camera watching him or because he happened to be born with a great emotional sense for fairness. None of these things are morality. Morality is acting out of duty, the pure one, the one that shows reverence for the moral law. The words here are important. Reverence is almost a mystical feeling. When you become aware of the force of the moral law, it overwhelms you almost like a religious or a mystical experience. Okay, and finally, how do you manage to do all these things? Through reason. And reason is an ability to grasp the a priori through reason, to grasp things through reason alone and not through a posteriori, through experience. And this is ability which is available to all human beings. Here he's not talking about a practical ability. He's not saying, oh look, Bob, he's a lot more intelligent than Nausicaa. It's not that kind of thing. It is something that is part of who we are as agents, as human beings that can make these kinds of decisions. So he has a big, interesting way of tying together everything, our rationality, our morality, and our agency. Okay, so then he goes on to give us the supreme principle of morality. Remember, this was the aim of the book, to give us the supreme principle of morality, and that is the categorical imperative. What does that mean? An imperative is a command. Remember when we talked about morality, we said it's not about what you can do, ability, what you may do, permission. It's about what you ought to do. So this captures the idea that you must, you should, you ought. What the supreme principle of morality counsels is a command. It is not, if you have nothing better to do or if you fancy it, you can do it. You ought to do it. There is a lot of force behind this command. And it is a categorical imperative. Categorical imperative is distinguished with a hypothetical imperative. Hypothetical imperative is an end that depends on something else. Now, if you want to drink a pint of beer, go to the pub. If you want to become healthy, then exercise. But you might say, I'm not really interested in beer, so I'm not going to go to the pub. I'm not really interested in being healthy, so I'm not going to exercise. The goal is dependent on whether you want to do it or not. And you can choose not to want to do it, that's perfectly fine. Then you won't do the things that are necessary to bring about this goal. That's the hypothetical one. If you want this, then do the other thing. The categorical one is the opposite. You are absolutely bound by it. It is not dependent on anything else. It is objectively necessary and absolutely binding. You don't say, today I don't feel like it, or I don't want this, so there's no point in doing it. Morality, expressed as a categorical imperative, is absolutely binding for everyone in virtue of being a rational being that recognizes this way in which morality binds us. It's not binding because I said so, because Kant said so. It's because morality is the kind of thing that binds us, and you are the kind of being that understands this obligation. Okay, the categorical imperative most certainly has 3 formulations. You might have 5. I've seen someone claim it has 7. We'll stick with the 3 formulations that are generally the way of introducing the categorical imperative. And as we go through them, they might ring a bell, because ideas from these formulations have passed down in a variety of ways in which we think about morality, in which we educate people to think morally. The first formulation then of the categorical imperative is the formula of universal law. Act only on that maxim through which you can, at the same time, will that it should become a universal law. What does this say? Well, you are considering doing something, you formulate a maxim. A maxim is just a complicated way of saying a proposed course of action, a kind of sentence that captures what it is that you're wanting to do. And you're saying, well, should I be doing this or not? Kant, help me out. And Kant says, well, here's a little test. Take your maxim, this sentence that you have formulated about your proposed course of action, what it is that you want to do, and put it through the categorical imperative as if it's kind of a moral machine, and in the end it comes out with an answer, yes or no. And one way of putting maxims through a categorical imperative is to ask if they are universalizable. Basically, what would happen if they became a maxim for everyone? If everyone were to act in accordance with this maxim that you are proposing to adopt. Kant gives 4 examples of how the categorical imperative works in practice. Suppose you're suffering from a horrible illness and there is no treatment for it, there is no cure, you're in an enormous amount of pain, your life is greatly disabled, and you know you're going to die relatively shortly, and you decide to commit suicide. So you're asking, should I, out of self-love, the love for myself to avoid the suffering and the pain that I'm in now, and the pain that I will be in the future, commit suicide? This is your maxim, and you put it through the categorical imperative, and you ask, basically, what would happen if everybody did this, if this was universalizable? And Kant's answer is, this kind of maxim can't even be universalized in conception. You cannot conceive of the motive of self-love, which is about self-preservation, also leading to the end of the self. Therefore, it's not universalizable. It is unfortunate that this is the first example because it's not very clear. See if you find the second example a bit clearer. The construction of the example of the second one is like the first one. Okay, in the second example, you need something very strongly, very urgently, and you make a promise in order to get the something that you need, but you also know that you're not going to keep the promise. At the time of making the promise, you know that you're going to break it. So your maxim, your proposed course of action, is something like, should I promise to do something in order to gain benefit when I know I won't be keeping my promise? And Kant's answer is that this cannot be universalized because you cannot conceive of promise making as something which is conditional, that you can break whenever you feel like it. This is not what a promise is. If you tried to explain promise to someone, an alien, who didn't know human practices, and you said, well, when you make a promise, you agree to do something, but if you feel you don't need to later on, you don't do it, or if you have something better to do, you don't do it. That wouldn't make any sense at all. That would not be how we conceive of promises. Promises are, by their very nature, the kinds of things that we're obligated to stick to. If everyone were to make promises and break them whenever they felt like it, there wouldn't be any sense in making promises anymore, and the concept itself would be contradictory. Okay, it's a contradiction in the conception of what a promise is, in the same way that the first example had a contradiction in the conception of what self-love is. Two more examples. The third example is an example where you might have a talent and you decide out of self-indulgence to neglect it, because developing this talent would take quite a bit of effort and it would be a difficult thing for you, and you decide, I'm going to take the easy way out and I'm just going to lounge about. I'm not going to develop my talent. Kant asks, is this universalizable? And again, the answer is no. What would happen if everybody behaved in this kind of way? Then nobody's talents would ever be developed at all. And you have therefore an obligation to develop your talents. Similarly, he asks, what if I were to suggest that I'm not going to help others when I have better things to do for myself? Well, this is not universalizable, because the kind of world where nobody helped anybody else would mean that other people would not help me. For examples 3 and 4, it's important to notice that we're not talking about empirical consequences. He's not talking about actual worlds, because you could imagine some actual worlds where everybody helped you and you never helped them back because everybody else was really nice and you just took advantage of them. So this is not a consequentialist argument. This is an argument about a logical consequence, that you cannot will it, that you are the only one who's helped, when you're willing to accept the benefit of the help of others. It's an argument about equality and justice, in a sense, that puts you on the same footing as everybody else, that you cannot will it, that you are special in that everybody has obligations towards you, but you have no obligations towards anybody else, because that collapses the whole idea of obligation. The idea of obligation is objective. It applies to everybody equally. Okay, one final thing about this formulation of the categorical imperative, it gives rise to two kinds of duties. There are perfect duties, where you're obliged to do the thing, like promise keeping, you're obliged to keep all promises that you have made, and there are imperfect duties. With imperfect duties, you have leeway to decide which ones you want to develop and how. If you're a person with many talents, Kant doesn't expect you to develop all of them. Developing some of them is perfectly fine, and you can choose which ones you would like to develop. That's why they're called imperfect duties. This formulation of the universal law, whether the maxim is universalizable, is supposed to be the equivalent thing as the second formulation. The second formulation is the formula of the ends in themselves. Okay. These things are supposed to say the same kind of thing from a different perspective. And the second one, second formulation of the categorical imperative is act in such a way that you always treat humanity, whether in your own person or in the person of any other, never simply as a means, but always at the same time as an end. Now, the first formulation might have reminded you of the golden rule. It's very similar to that kind of idea of not doing unto others what you don't want to happen to you. The second formulation has even more popular sort of tendrils into the way we talk about morality now, the idea of treating others as ends and not just as means. Okay. What does this mean for Kant, who introduced this distinction? Well, for Kant, we respect humanity because we are rational beings. He has a complex argument that ties together our freedom, our ability to make choices that are genuinely ours, with rationality, the ability to recognize that these choices are binding in a particular way and are true, with morality, the force of obligation that relates to what is right and what is wrong. To treat another person as an end in themselves is to treat them as someone who is part of this rational, free and moral type of being. It's a recognition of a rational nature which is our ability to set our own goals and ends. The reason I can do whatever I like to this book is because it is a thing and it doesn't set its own ends. The reason I can't do the same thing to another human being is because they are an agent who can set their own ends, and by treating them as a means, I am stopping them, I'm preventing them from expressing their rationality and their ability to set their own ends as free agents. Okay, this doesn't mean that I can never treat other people as means. I can treat them as means as long as I also treat them as ends. He says, never treat solely, only as means. So if you go to the ticket counter and you buy a train ticket for the train that you want to take, you are treating the official at the ticket counter as a means to your end. All you need from that person is a ticket. But equally, he has it as his end to sell tickets. Therefore, it's perfectly compatible for you to treat them as a means and respect their end at the same time. This doesn't work the same way with promise keeping. Imagine you promise to do something knowing that you're not going to do it. By promising, you know that you're engaging in a practice where the other person has it as their end, that you do what it is that you promise to do. But you are setting out to break your promise. Therefore, from the beginning, you're going to be treating them as a means to your end. Your end is to get what you want by breaking the promise. Their end is to keep to the promise. Okay. In the same way, you can treat yourself as a means rather than as an end in the suicide example, according to Kant. Yeah. And finally, the third formulation of the categorical imperative. This is the formula of the kingdom of ends. We're nearly there. This is that every rational being must so act as if it were through his maxim always a law-making member in the universal kingdom of ends. What does that mean? That means that Kant is thinking of a community who all act on universalizable maxims. Here he's talking about our shared humanity, our shared rationality. He wants us to respect agency, the ability to set ends, as we see it in other people, not just in ourselves, and as we see it in everybody who is human. He wants us to see everybody as subject to the moral law, but at the same time as a legislator. You are both things, and so is everybody else. You're bound by the moral law, but you also make the moral law. Not in a subjective way, not in an individual, this is what I fancy to do today way, but in a rational being who accepts and sees, because of his rationality, why the moral law is obligatory. Okay? It's a very complex thought, but it's a beautiful thought as well. It's a very interesting thought. Now, I've got bad news and good news. The bad news is that this hasn't finished the groundwork. We've only done 2/3 of the groundwork. There's still 1/3 of this book still coming up. The good news is that the last third is very demanding. It's not that it's not important, but maybe it's not the most important thing to know about Kant if you want a really basic introduction to his ideas. Therefore, what I'm going to do is, I'm going to talk to you now about objections to deontology, to Kantian deontology, and leave the third part for the groundwork for another video. If you're really interested in Kant and you really want to know what happens in the third part of the groundwork, just wait for the third video on deontology, you can watch that. If you feel that, well, you've heard enough of Kant, this will do for now, then you can stop with this video and move on to something else. You'll have enough of a grasp of deontology to understand what other theories have to say as opposed to Kantian deontology. And by the way, there are other versions of deontology, of course. Rawls is a very famous political philosopher who has a deontological account. Contractarianism is a version of deontology. But really, if you don't start with Kant, it's difficult to understand any of the others. And he has by far the most in-depth and challenging and interesting account of deontology. Having said all that, we'll talk about some objections to deontology, and remember, exactly like consequentialism, these objections are simplified for the purpose of presenting them for the first time. They are not devastating arguments against deontology, any more not than the ones we saw against consequentialism. The same way that the consequentialist has a lot of replies and modifications of the theory to counter these kinds of objections, so does the deontologist. The story doesn't stop here, but obviously the video has to stop somewhere. We can't keep going forever. Okay, objections. One first objection that perhaps had occurred to you as well when we're talking about acting out of the motive of duty is the idea that perhaps the kind of person who does that doesn't appear to be very nice or very moral. Imagine you go see your aunt and you turn up and she's in hospital and she's been feeling very poorly, and you go see her and she's particularly moved that you've come to see her, and she says, "Thank you, this is just absolutely wonderful. I always knew that you were such a lovely, kind niece, and now I know you came to see me, and I really appreciate your warmth and your love for me." And you say, "No, Auntie, I did it out of duty. I'm a Kantian. It's not inclination that brought me here and sentiment. These are the kinds of things we put to one side. I came here because I ought to, and I rationally see that it is my obligation to come and see you." No auntie in the world is going to be pleased with that visit. If anything, most people would say, "Okay, best go then. I don't really want to see you anymore." If you feel that you're obliged to do it, you see how we use the words in a different way. If you feel that you're obliged to do it, then it doesn't count. So a lot of people criticize Kantian theory for being cold, for not making use of the emotions in a way that could be part of morality, and for coming up with suggestions about how we should behave that leave us perhaps appearing to be less genuine and less committed to what it is that we're doing, visiting the auntie because we love her, than to what Kant thinks is a moral thing to do, to act out of duty. A second problem that's perhaps related to the idea of how Kant sees the emotions is that you have a lack of your own knowledge of your own motives. Do you remember I told you that to act out of duty is something that you might not even know yourself if you're doing? This is not a practical problem. It's not that if we see you going to see your auntie, we don't know whether you did it because you're emotionally inclined to do it, because you happen to love her, or because you're truly doing it because you recognize it is your duty in a Kantian pure way to do it. So it's not a problem that we can't really know what your motives are because all we see is your actions and their consequences. This is deeper than that. For Kant, we never could know, even you couldn't know, and nobody could know. This then gives a very schizophrenic, almost, account of your motives, where the motive of acting out of duty is kind of separate from all the other motives that you happen to have and are aware of, and kind of operates in a metaphysically also bizarre way, separated from everything else. This kind of objection also has tendrils into other objections with the Kantian distinction between the noumenal world, which is reached through a priori reason, and the phenomenal world, the world of appearances. Kant says a lot of interesting things about these two, but a lot of commentators feel that at the end of the day it's not clear how the two worlds combine. And our experience of who we are, of our agency, of our freedom, and of our morality doesn't really correspond to this schizophrenic separation of two parts of us. Okay. Another possible problem is the formulation of the maxim in the first place. How specific are you going to be with the formulation of the maxim? If you make a maxim extremely specific, you can get away with it being universalizable. "I will break promises whenever it suits me" is not universalizable. But if you say something very specific, "I will break this particular promise because it suits me to do so in this particular situation, and you give details to the situation in such a way that you make it almost unique, then it will be universalizable. Also, this kind of formulation of maxims can become too rigid. It can become too rigid because it doesn't allow for any kind of exceptions. Most people would like to think that yes, promise keeping doesn't make any sense unless we commit to it and unless we generally and almost always keep our promises. But in some situations, it would be practically ridiculous to keep a promise. This is an example that was put to Kant himself. Imagine you've made a promise to tell the truth, or you're a truth-telling person, you're committed to truth, because telling the truth is the kind of maxim that universalizes in the categorical imperative. And somebody comes to your door looking for two people you've hidden in your attic. The reason you've hidden these two people in your attic is the fact that the guy who comes to the door is a mad axeman and is looking for these two people to kill them. And unfortunately, the mad axeman asks you directly, are you hiding the two people that I want to kill in your attic? And you think, well, what is my maxim here? To tell lies when it suits my purpose, and this is not universalizable, therefore I must tell the truth. And you say, yeah, they're up in the attic, and off he goes and kills them. Now, most people would think that in some cases it's okay to not tell the truth. In some cases, it's okay to not keep promises, and it is a matter of moral judgment. It is a matter of the particulars and the details, and that morality has to be sensitive to these kinds of particulars of situations. That on the whole you should tell the truth, but not when it is a mad axeman that is trying to kill your friends hiding in the attic. In that kind of case, it's perfectly okay to tell a lie. And this is not immoral, this is what you ought to do. You ought to tell a lie because of the circumstances in that kind of case. What do you think Kant responded to this kind of counter-example? Well, Kant always goes all in with his theory, and he said, of course you tell the truth in this case. Because, this is not because Kant is an idiot, right? Whenever you come up with an objection that makes out some great philosopher to be a complete idiot, pause for a second and consider, why is this person's work still being discussed by everybody if he's so obviously idiotic? The answer is that the theory is much more complicated, and while it may have a weakness in this particular respect, while there may be a genuine objection here, it's definitely not a superficial or a silly one. And the reason Kant is not worried about this is because his version of morality is pure, because it's tied to agency and you, what is inside you. What he evaluates you for is not what happens out in the world, things that you have no control over. You cannot control what the mad axeman is going to do next. What he does is his responsibility, his choice. It is part of freedom that your agency stops with yourself, and you respect his agency in giving him the kind of answer that doesn't treat him as a means to an end. What he decides to do next is his responsibility, something for which he will be judged. So Kant says, you tell the truth, and then you probably sort of step in front of the mad axeman to stop him from killing your friends. Anyway. So the categorical imperative could end up with recommendations that are far too rigid. They're not sensitive to particular circumstances. It could also end up being quite empty. So if we're looking for the categorical imperative to help us with our actions, which is something that people are often interested in when they read up on moral philosophy, and they expect these kinds of theories to tell them something useful about how to behave out there in the world. If the categorical imperative gives you answers that are too rigid, like never lie, even in the axeman case, then it's not very helpful in guiding your action. And if it gives you answers that are empty, again, it's not very helpful. Consider the maxim, I will only kill babies who cry through the night. It kind of sounds like this is universalizable because it's very specific. But nobody would ever think that this is the morally right thing to do. So how do you make sure you only formulate maxims that ought to be universalizable in the first place? Do you see the problem has now gone backwards? Now the onus is on to you to formulate the right maxims in the first place. But this was supposed to be the helpful test that gave us the answer, not the test that says if you know the answer already, you're going to get it right. Okay, we're nearly there. 3 more objections. What happens when 2 duties conflict? What happens if we have 2 maxims that both pass the categorical imperative, but they conflict with each other? Something else needs to come into play now to give us the answer. But the categorical imperative was supposed to be the supreme principle of morality. So what is the other thing? Penultimate objection. When I was giving you the examples of the categorical imperative and how maxims are universalizable, remember, suicide, promise keeping, develop my own talents and help others, did you notice a problem with them? Did you notice that in discussing these examples and how these maxims are not universalizable, there is a very real worry that Kant has introduced heteronymous considerations. Remember, morality is autonomous, it's not dependent on anything else. But in the discussion of the examples, Kant introduces things from outside of morality. In the suicide example, he relies on self-love. But self-love is an emotion. Some people might feel it, some people might feel it to a great extent, and some people might feel it to a very little extent, or not at all. That makes morality conditional on having this emotion in the first place. Helping others. Well, this is also conditional because it appeals to prudential considerations. It says, I should help others because they will help me. But this is a reason that's prudential about my own good. It is not an autonomous moral reason, one which any being would ascribe to by virtue of their ability to reason a priori. It is something that's conditional and prudential on me valuing my own good. Last objection. It kind of seems like the categorical imperative only works if you're already committed to what it is that is supposed to be telling you ought to be doing. So promise keeping, you already have to be committed to the value of promises in order to see that promise breaking is not universalizable. You have to think of promises already as part of your moral duties in order for it to make sense. The contradictions in conception seem to carry quite a lot of baggage already about what is morally obligatory before you put anything into the categorical imperative. So again, we don't have a test that's going to give us an answer. We have a test that's going to confirm the answer we come to the test with. That doesn't help in any way. Okay, so this was the first 2 parts of the groundwork of the metaphysics of morals and some objections to them. There are a lot of replies to these kinds of objections, but we'll leave that kind of thing for another day, and we'll definitely leave the 3rd part of the categorical imperative for another video. If you're still with me, next time we're going to do virtue ethics. This is the 3rd alternative normative theory that we're going to look at. We had consequentialism, we have deontology, where we mainly talked about Kant, who's pretty much the basis of deontological theories. And next time we're going to talk about virtue ethics. Virtue ethics is a revival of an idea that comes from Aristotle about how you ought to live the good life. That was proposed relatively recently in the last sort of 50 years or so as an alternative to deontology and consequentialism. So next time we'll talk about virtue ethics and we'll talk about Aristotle. And I shall see you then. Bye bye.